Hello everybody, my name is Brady and I'm a 19th century American historian and we're back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more of Mr. Beat's American Presidential Election series. But before we get started, I do want to give a couple shout outs to the newest channel members. Thank you to Casey Wood and Sergey Big Hands Rachmaninoff. So thank you both for becoming channel members, and if any of you want to become a channel member, there's a link to do so in the description box below and probably in the pinned comment. So that's there. Now let's get into the main video. So today we're going to be checking out the American presidential election of 1848. And I am a huge defender of the importance of this period in American history. I always emphasize that I think it goes underappreciated. A lot of the time we jump from some of the Andrew Jackson-y stuff into the Civil War without really getting into the stuff in between. I understand why you may not be interested in Zachary Taylor, because Zachary Taylor, I would say, is the president during this period, my favorite period in American history, that I am least interested in. Because Zachary Taylor was not where the political drama was. He came out of the Mexican-American War. He was a military guy who was not really all that political. He was adopted by a party that he really wasn't affiliated with prior, and I totally understand why you're not that interested in him. However, that doesn't mean the period isn't that important, because when the president isn't where the drama is, you know that drama has to be somewhere else. And in this case, it's in the legislature, and there's a whole bunch of drama over the Fugitive Slave Act. That's a huge one, so there's going to be a decent amount to talk about if we talk about this time. How much is there to say about Taylor's presidency? Well, we'll see if I come up with any important points to make during this video, but I'm excited to get it started because we haven't watched a Mr. Beat video in a minute. So let's do this.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History.
Yay!
The 16th presidential election in American history took place on Tuesday, November 7th, 1848. This was the first election that took place on the same day in every state. By law, from this point forward, Election Day would be on a Tuesday. James Polk had...
This is one of the weird things, and this is kind of a side note, kind of not. For people not in the United States, it may seem weird to you, but Election Day is not a federal holiday. People have to get work off or find time to get away from work sometimes in order to go vote. A lot of people are discouraged from voting because they just can't make that time. This last election was different because there was so much mail-in voting and that sort of stuff, and there were different options, and not everywhere made that as readily available before the most recent election. But I still find it absolutely insane that it's still not a federal holiday.
Spent the past 4 years kicking butts and taking names. Every major objective he had going into office was accomplished. He had got half of Oregon without going to war with Britain, got the northern half of Mexico by bullying them into a war, he reduced the tariff, and he created an independent treasury. Satisfied...
The treasury thing is often understated. When we talk about gaining the Oregon territory, that was kind of huge. I kind of understand how he's able to dance around this and able to get this territory without a conflict with the British. Although everybody wants to look tough in this situation, I don't think the British really want this sort of a conflict. And the more conflicts we get into that with them, and like the further out west we go, the harder it's going to be to defend that. But if we did get into an actual conflict, America does have one weakness. We don't typically do very well against Canadians. So, you know, Canadians would be, in a sense, leading the way on that one. And you know, we didn't do too well when we tried to go into Canada in the Revolution. We didn't do too well on the Canadian front in the War of 1812. So maybe Canadians are our big weakness. And if we actually got into a conflict, the Canadians would have kicked our butts again. Because that seems to be what happens.
Without going to war with Britain, got the northern half of Mexico by bullying them into a war.
And the Mexico thing, we basically put Americans like on like the wrong side of like the disputed line. Well, we would make the argument that no, we have up to this territory. This is where we are, but we're clearly pushing the line a little bit, and we're just waiting for a conflict, and we basically manufactured a reason to get into the war, and then we kind of destroyed Mexico because we are pretty darn powerful at this point. Before the Mexican-American War, I would still describe America as, and I guess it's always in kind of a building process, but we're starting to really see the product of how much time has been put into building America as a new country with how much they dominate in Mexico. Because like it really is impressive how quickly America has built up its military might.
He reduced the tariff, and he created an independent treasury. Satisfied with accomplishing his goals, he promised not to run for re-election. His health was actually declining anyway, and he would die of cholera 3 months after leaving office, having the shortest retirement of all presidents in American history. In his place, the Democratic Party nominated Lewis Cass, who since 1844 had become a senator for Michigan. Cass beat out Martin VanBuren for the nomination, who was no longer having luck with the political party he helped create. The Democrats nominated William Orlando Butler to run with Cass, a general who had recently fought in the Mexican-American War. Martin VanBuren, upset and perhaps bitter at losing to Cass for the nomination, found a new political party.
I guess before we get into the VanBuren stuff, since we are fresh off of a war, that means we have a new round of war heroes. So this is actually a really good idea to put in a Mexican-American War general as one of your two-party nominees. I think that's actually a really good idea. Unfortunately, the Whigs are going to get ahead of you on this. The fact that Zachary Taylor is as popular as he is based on his Mexican-American War history, and he's, from what I can tell, just a bigger name at the time. And he's at the forefront. He's not going to be vice president. He's going to be president. And I think it's probably going to get a little bit more into his personal politics as we get into this. So I'll save this part for in a second.
With Cass, a general who had recently fought in the Mexican-American War. Martin VanBuren, upset and perhaps bitter at losing to Cass for the nomination, found a new political party, the Free Soil Party, led by Salmon P. Chase and John Parker Hale.
Salmon P. Chase, you might want to remember that name if you're interested in the American Civil War. He's going to be part of the Lincoln cabinet, so we're starting to really get into that stuff. We're pretty close. It's 1848. Not that much longer. We have a lot of major Civil War figures who are on the scene. Some of them rise up during kind of the Mexican-American War. We've got a lot of names that are going to seem pretty familiar from a time that people are more interested in. And I guess we're starting to get into the end of this underappreciated period in American history. It's Taylor, and then we'll have to talk about Millard Fillmore in a little bit, who I'm not particularly excited about either. He's probably one of the least exciting vice presidents to ascend to the presidency, so that's not nearly as fun either. So okay, I get it if you don't care about this period. I totally get it, though. Try to care? That's all I can ask.
Mostly based out of New York, the party called for ending the expansion of slavery out west. Most of their support came from anti-slavery Democrats, but some Whigs also joined their cause. VanBuren was their nominee, with Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy Adams and grandson of John Adams, as his running mate. Partially because of the rise of the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party lost most of its support.
So Charles Francis Adams, I believe that's the father of Henry Adams, who is like kind of one of the last like real famous Adamses. Like the family goes on or whatever, but there's this famous book like The Education of Henry Adams, and he's kind of seen as one of the that family is kind of generally seen as at least a generation behind at all times, it seems. Like John Adams was just a little bit of an outsider in the revolutionary generation. John Quincy was a little bit of an outsider in the age of Jackson, and I wonder if it's the same for this Adams. He's the one that I've studied the least among them, because I skip over this generation and then get to Henry Adams, who I think is a very interesting character. There's a new book on him. I think it's called, I don't know if it's new or not, but I recently got it, The Last American Aristocrat or something, and I'm very excited to learn more about him. That family is just so odd.
They did nominate Garrett Smith, brother-in-law to their former presidential nominee, James Birney. Keep it in the family. What about the Whigs?
That doesn't seem right.
General Zachary Taylor of Louisiana was an attractive candidate because he was a war hero, leading American forces to victories in the Mexican-American War. Here's the thing, though. He wasn't very political and had never even voted in an election himself. In fact, this is why Taylor was courted by both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. Few knew exactly where he stood on major issues. Taylor decided to declare himself as a Whig, though, and easily won their nomination, beating...
So, Taylor, a lot of people idealize an element that Taylor does have, though, that I can kind of appreciate, like the disinterested executive. It kind of makes you think of Washington in a lot of ways. Washington in general was not the most political. They wanted somebody who could kind of be above the fray, although he would eventually start to lean into that Federalist identity a little bit more. At the time, a lot of people saw him as the person who would have everyone's interests at heart, because he was not as openly political. He just had the right image for that sort of thing. So I guess I kind of appreciate what they're doing with Taylor. And he's commander-in-chief. He could handle the military stuff if he really had to. I mean, there probably are few more qualified than him in that department, so he's got that going for him, and he'll leave a lot of the political arguing to the legislature. And a lot of people appreciate that. The executive kind of staying out of that stuff, being more of a facilitator and kind of letting the Congress work things out on their own. Let the arguing go on there and just be the dignified executive who kind of keeps things in order. Like, I get the appeal. I can totally understand from this perspective.
Out big names like Henry Clay, himself as a Whig, though, and easily won their nomination, beating out big names like Henry Clay.
Perpetually almost president Henry Clay loses again.
Daniel Webster, and fellow Mexican-American war hero Winfield Scott. Millard Fillmore, a former U.S. representative and the controller of New York, was Taylor's running mate. The campaigns were pretty chill this year, with no major issues that sharply divided the parties. I say that because the Free Soil Party had a small chance of actually winning because they weren't on the ballot in several states. In the early part of the Mexican-American War, the Whigs mostly criticized James Polk for his recklessness that led to the war. However, after the United States kicked butt in the war, now the Whigs had seemed to forget this and were glorifying General Taylor's war success.
Like, when you gain that much territory, it's inevitably going to be a little bit popular, but a lot of the arguments were... A lot of people, you'll probably know, ended up making the arguments of, yeah, this war was started under false pretenses, we probably shouldn't have done this, false flag operation, that sort of stuff. And they're not necessarily wrong to make that argument, but it comes to a point where making that argument just isn't going to get you anywhere politically. It makes me think of the Louisiana Purchase with Thomas Jefferson. He kind of goes ahead of the legislature and basically makes the purchase without asking their permission, totally against what he stood for at the time. But the decision was so popular that they couldn't really harp on that contradiction. They just had to let it be. Like, the Federalists theoretically should have clamped down on that, but what argument are you going to make? Are you really going to argue against the guy who doubled the size of the country? I think farmers or whatever, people looking to find their riches, are probably going to be more in his favor than you, the perhaps principled person who has like a rightful objection to what he did on, I guess, from a governing standpoint, but like, what have you done for the voters lately?
Taylor himself was pretty vague about where he stood on the issues, though. This was the first election in which citizens of the new states of Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Wisconsin could all cast votes. And here are the results. Zachary Taylor won, becoming the 12th president of the United States. This was the Whig Party's second and last presidential win, but they would remain a force for several years. Taylor received 163 electoral votes.
So, yeah, the Whig Party, they're not... I claimed early on that the Federalist Party, they kind of died a very slow death at the hands of Jefferson, and it just took a while for them to die. I think the Whig Party was a bit more resilient because they still had a decent presence outside of the presidency. And eventually a lot of Whigs are going to end up being absorbed into what is now the Republican Party. A completely different Republican Party than the Republican Party we have today, but the same kind of roots go back to that. Yeah.
Cass received 127 electoral votes. Martin VanBuren and Garrett Smith didn't receive any. Taylor received 47.3% of the popular vote to Cass's 42.5%, VanBuren's 10.1%, and Smith's 0.1%. Millard Fillmore became the 12th vice president in American history.
Kind of crazy.
This was the first of two presidential elections where the two leading candidates evenly split the states for the electoral vote. Historian George Pierce Garrison wrote a...
Since Millard Fillmore is kind of on a subject of discussion here, he's one of those presidents that there's just not a lot of good writing on. Like, if you want to study him, you got to look for the deep cuts. They have some books that go over, like, the history of, like, vice presidents or the vice presidents who ascended to the presidency, and he might be included in that sort of stuff. But overall, Millard Fillmore, I can't think of, like, a great biography by him. I'm sure there are decent ones, but he might be overdue for a new one at this point. Even Zachary Taylor, there's not a whole lot on. I've seen some okay books on Zachary Taylor, but they focus more on his military life, because there's not as much to work with politically.
Of this election, quote, practically the only thing it decided was that a Whig general should be made president because he had done effective work in carrying on a Democratic war. Had Taylor ran as a Democrat,
kind of a good point
he likely still would have won the election. So the Whigs lucked out by getting him.
Look at that number. Remember how low that used to be?
I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
All right, so that was the election of 1848. We're about to get into the Civil War pretty soon. We don't have that much time left before this gets a little uncomfortable for everybody involved. But hey, this was fun. And we're getting towards the end of the area in which I like to study. Because I open my videos and I say I'm a 19th century American historian. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the whole 19th century. I think it would be pretty arbitrary to say my area of study is 1801 to like the end of the century and then I stop. And to measure it just by numbers is kind of silly, but I think it would take too long in every single introduction of my videos to explain the actual scope of my area of study in kind of a time-efficient way. Like, I still do some stuff from, like, the 18th century, and I dabble in some other areas, but I really like the first half of the 19th century. But that doesn't sound as good in my introduction. I'm a first half of the 19th century American historian. No, that wouldn't really sound that good. And it sounds so unnatural. But, yeah, I've really enjoyed this part. And I'm glad I did another one of these. It's been a little while. So who we got next? Oh, Franklin Pierce. My God. We're getting into some forgotten territory here. I think Franklin Pierce, he might be the most forgotten president. Yeah, he might be the most forgotten president out of any of them. It might be different for you than it is for me, but let's say I'm going through the presidents and I have to name them in order. I think he is definitely the one I am most likely to accidentally skip over, as far as the earlier ones go. Once you get into the later ones, I don't know, I'm bad at remembering order. Chronology, who needs it? I do history. I'm not a chronology artist. I don't know. All right, thank you guys for watching. Become a channel member, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you.